Let's now get started on learning JavaScript. First, let's get some terminology out of the way so we can start writing some code. So, in terminology, the first thing that we're going to look at is white space. A white space is a group of characters comprised of the space character, which is introduced when you press the space bar, or the tab character, which is introduced when you press the tab key, and the new line character that gets inserted when you press the enter key. These characters are not visible on the computer screen but are used to separate other words. The second terminology we have is the variables and literals. Literals are just values without a name associated with them. So for example, the number 9 or a string with the words "this is a string" would be literals. Identifiers are just English words that provide name to literals and are called variables. The next term that we have are expressions. Expressions are just a simple way to say one statement in JavaScript. If the program is terminated correctly with semicolons everywhere, we will go over this later in the course, but for a minute assume that each line in the program is terminated correctly with a semicolon, then an expression would be the text excluding the comments between two semicolons. The next would be the JavaScript runtime. The runtime is the program that will execute your JavaScript code. It has to understand all of your JavaScript code and execute it line by line. Each browser maker has usually implemented their own JavaScript runtime. So for example, Internet Explorer has their runtime and it's called Trident. Firefox has their own runtime which is called as Gecko, and Chrome's runtime is called as V8. The next terminology is data type. So when we execute a program or a script and the JavaScript runtime comes across a variable or a literal, it needs to know whether to treat that thing as a number, a string, a boolean, or some other type. This type is called the type of the data, or in short, the data type. Now that we have the terminology out of the way, we can start writing some code. Actually, before we can write code, one more thing. Remember how I told you that we will initially learn JavaScript out of the browser so we can learn the language itself separately? Well, it is about that. So we will utilize two JavaScript runtimes for learning JavaScript purely as a language. The first is called Node.js and the second is called CScript. You will have to download Node.js installer from the http://node.js org website. And for CScript, you don't need to do anything. It is already present on your computer. At this point, if you have not already downloaded and installed Node.exe, please go ahead and do that. Node.js is a platform created by the open source community to enable developers to write server-side code. Node is based off Google's V8 JavaScript runtime and is very similar to the JavaScript runtime offered by browsers. We will occasionally use CScript, especially initially during assignments, because reading user input using Node.exe is not easy to understand until we have gone over how asynchronous calls and callbacks work. Alright, so assuming you have now installed Node.js, let's finally get started on writing some code. So start a command prompt. On a Windows 8 system, you can just press the Windows plus X keys together and then select command prompt from the menu that pops up. Who's using the command prompt and cd command to change directories, navigate to your documents directories. Once there, create a directory there called JavaScript. Copy the JavaScript file attached with this lesson named syntax and basics.js and open it up in your editor of choice. Whichever editor you are using, enable line numbering in there so that you can follow along the rest of the lesson. Alright, on to the lesson. So here on line number 3, I say that JavaScript is case sensitive. What it means is that if you declare a variable and then you declare the variable again with slightly different casing of various characters in the variable name, then JavaScript will understand that these are two separate variables. So for example, here we see that on line number 4, we declare the variable x with a small case, and then on line number 5, we declare a variable x again with a capital case. And then on line number 7, we are trying to print the two variables, the small case x and the capital case x. And if you run this thing, then you will see that you actually have two separate variables printing with two separate values. Now, line number 9. Before we actually go to line number 9, let's look at the console.log. Any text inside console.log is printed on the screen. Sidetracking for a minute, you might ask, what is a console and what is a log? Well, in the earlier days of computers, the only way to interact with a computer used to be via punch cards and tapes. So console used to refer to the data entry and output display mechanism. Nowadays, input is pretty much always provided using keyboard, mouse, touch panels, etc. And output usually goes to screen. But the terminology has carried over. And log is short, it's a very short form of logging and just means outputting data somewhere. So console.log just means output the data to the screen. In many languages, dollar has a special meaning. Well, not in JavaScript. It is perfectly valid to use it as a variable name. So you see, on line number 11, we declare a variable which is called dollar, and we assign it a value 25. And then we go ahead and print that on line number 13. The next thing, notice that in JavaScript, comments can be written in two different ways. Line 15 shows the first way, and then line 16 through 18 show the second way. So on line 15, we see that // and then this is a single line comment is one single comment. // and then a bunch of text is one single line of comment. It cannot be multi-line. If you want to write multi-line comments, then you have to say /* and then write whatever text you want and then end it with a // like here. So this is the multi-line comment. In JavaScript, it is very highly recommended to use the // kind of single line comments rather than the multi-line comment. The reasons for this will become clear in a later point of time, but for now, just understand that line 15 is the better way of writing comments. Then note that in statements in JavaScript are always terminated with a semicolon. JavaScript runtime is quite forgiving and will automatically insert a semicolon when running your program if you haven't done it yourself. But the runtime can make mistakes and it may insert a semicolon incorrectly, and you will have a very hard time trying to figure out what is going wrong. So always put a semicolon at the end of your statements. The next thing that we are looking at is line 23, which says use camel casing for variable and function names. Now what is camel casing? Just like the head of a camel is usually a little bit lower than its hump. So variables in JavaScript are usually declared starting with a small letter, and then any word following in the same variable starts with a capital, like here. You see camel casing. That's what camel casing is. Always use it. It's a good idea to use this convention for writing your JavaScript programs. It makes it easy to read and easy to maintain. Then between lines 25 and 27, this is a matter of style. So you see there's an if statement and it contains inside true, and then you see the start of the curly brace. And then the curly brace finishes up on line 27 with the ending curly brace. Now, when we write code in JavaScript, the starting curly brace is not placed on a line by itself, like most of the languages. Instead, it is placed at the end of the previous line, and the ending curly brace is placed on a line all by itself. This style of indentation or putting curly braces around around code is called the Kernighan and Ritchie style. There were two great developers who developed the C programming language. So either ways, in JavaScript, this is the convention for writing curly braces. The next is all variables in JavaScript are declared using the type var, which just means that the identifier is a variable. A variable can hold any type of data. You can see how the name variable here on line 30 is holding a string, whereas the mynum variable here is holding a value which is an actually integer, right? So this is how variables are declared in JavaScript. Everything, all sort of variables are just declared using the identifier or the keyword var. Now let's run this let's run this program. So if you already installed the node.exe, you can just type node and then the name of the file that is attached with this lesson, which is 10-syntax and basics.js. So if we run it here, we see that the value small case x10 and capital case x20 is printed, which comes from line 7 in the program right over here, which shows that JavaScript is case sensitive. Then we also see from line number 11 that dollar has no special meaning. It is just a variable name that is printed again here as $25. Next, we will concentrate on data types. Recall from the terminology earlier that a data type is the type of the various data elements. In JavaScript, there are 3 different types of data types. The first one is primitive data types. Primitive data types are data types that the JavaScript engine inherently understands. There are 3 primitive data types: numbers, booleans, and strings. Since JavaScript strives for simplicity, there are no different data types for integers versus floats. JavaScript uses 64-bit to represent any integer or floating point number, which makes life pretty simple. Then the second are Boolean data types. These can have values true or false. If you look on the screen, you can see on line number 6, we are declaring a variable a number which has value 10. And then we are declaring another variable on line 7 that is named a boolean and has the value false. The third are strings. Now, unlike C, C++, strings are first-class citizens in JavaScript. Strings are immutable, which is to say that strings cannot be modified once they have been created. You can reassign a string variable, and then you can reassign a new value, but you cannot modify the original string. String literals can be created by either enclosing them in double quotes or single quotes. And it is even legal to enclose double quotes within single quotes or vice versa. So for example, here if you look at line number 5, you can see we have declared a variable a string here, and then inside it contains something saying this is a string, which is double quoted. Personally, I always enclose single quoted strings within double quoted strings, as I come from a C world where single quotes are used for characters and double quotes for strings. That brings us to the topic of characters. There is no explicit character type in JavaScript. If you want just one character, create a string with just one character. Usually in other languages, when you declare a variable, you will prefix it with a keyword that declares the type of the variable. In JavaScript, it is not so. It is important to remember that although the JavaScript runtime, by the way, JavaScript runtimes are also more commonly called as JavaScript engines. So going back, even though the JavaScript runtime can differentiate between the 3 types that we just declared, that we just actually told you about, that's the numbers, the booleans, and the strings, all of these variables are declared using the data type var. Now, to look at the data type of a variable or a literal, you can use the JavaScript built-in function called typeof. You can see an example of the primitive types between lines 1 through 11. We already went through the strings, the numbers, the booleans, and then between 9 and 11, you see we are printing the type of the data using the typeof function. So if you run this program, you are going to end up seeing a string being printed here, a number being printed here, and boolean being printed here. Let's run it and see what happens. So here you can see is for a string, it prints this is a string, and then it prints the data type string. For a number, it prints the actual value, and then the type is number. For the Boolean, it prints the value false, and then it prints the data type as Boolean. Now, one point to keep in mind is that if you perform operations between dissimilar data types in JavaScript, the engine converts the lower type of data value or data type to a higher data type. Such automatic conversions are called as coercion. See on line 16 how adding a number to a string converts the number to a string inside console.log. So here you have the number that we already defined, right? Here we defined as, we actually assigned it a value 10. Then here we are saying to the number add an empty string. Double quotes and double quotes with nothing in between is an empty string, as you might already know. So adding a number and a string produces a string. That is what JavaScript automatically does. It assumes that numbers cannot in any meaningful way be added to a string without converting them to strings, so it automatically converts them to string. So now if you print again through line 16, you will see that now a number and its data type is actually string. So here it prints the a number and it prints that it has now been converted to strings. Now the second type of data types are called composite data types. Composite data types are container types, which is to say that they contain a collection of primitive data types and potentially other composite data types. If you are familiar with object-oriented programming, then a composite data type is effectively an object. We will go over objects at a later point of time, but for point of illustration, see between line 21 and 25. How we create new objects and how the JavaScript function typeof returns the type as an object. So look at line 21 here. We are, for a minute, forego the fact that you don't understand the syntax very well, which says new object. Assume that somehow it's returning an object. So we are assigning to this variable an object, and to the variable an array. When you print these things using line 24 and 25, the type will actually be returned as object for both of these things. So if we go back and look at our output, here an object has the type object, an array has the type object. So that way both of these things have the type object. Now coming to the last type of data types, the last type of data types are special types. These are types that are useful in a limited sense only. Two of them, i.e. undefined and null, are used more often than others. The undefined type is an interesting type. It essentially means that you declared a variable but did not put any value inside it. So that way it is the type that describes absence of value. If you look on line 30 here, we just declared a variable var undefined object. There is nothing which says on the right hand side of this variable, we don't have an equal and then a value. So this variable has been declared. The JavaScript runtime understands that there is a variable by this name, but there is no value inside it. So this thing has an absence of value. There is nothing that's assigned inside of it. Now null on the other hand is a type that means yes, we did assign it a value, but the value is of empty type. So look here on line 29. We say var null var equals and then we assign it the value null. What this means is that we have assigned it a value, it's just that the value is empty. Now there is something that you should remember. The type of variable, the type of function in JavaScript usually works correctly and prints the right output, but in case of undefined and nulls, it may potentially lie. So undefined actually doesn't really lie, but null it does lie. So if you look on this line, we are printing the data type of undefined object. And if you look here, the type of actually says undefined. It doesn't know what it is, so it says undefined. But for null variable, it actually says object. Note that this is incorrect. This is a bug in JavaScript. Don't get confused if you see this thing. Null value actually means that there is a value that is assigned, but the value is of type empty. While we are talking about data types and special data types and composite data types and primitive and so on, it is also a good point to visit something that is unique and interesting in JavaScript. which is to say JavaScript has a concept of truthiness or falsiness, or a concept of true or false associated with pretty much anything. You can take an object, and if you use it as a Boolean expression, JavaScript will try to interpret it as true or false. So in JavaScript, once you know that, and you will see it being used in many places, it's important to realize where certain things will be treated as false and where other things will be treated as true. So before we go there, look at the code here. First, there is an interesting way of writing an if statement. Let's see this, and then we'll go over to what we were talking about. And the interesting way of writing an if statement is you put the Boolean expression that you would put inside if, and then you put a question mark, and then you put the value that you want to be returned if the Boolean expression here is true, and then put a colon semicolon here, and then the value to be returned if the Boolean expression is false, and then semicolon. This is how you can write. This is one way of writing an if statement. Now, once we understand this portion, let's look at something else. JavaScript considers the following variables, literals, keywords, whatever you want to call them, as false. If you use them as a standalone Boolean expression, JavaScript will treat them as false. So the keyword false, the keyword null, the keyword undefined, or actually I should say the data type undefined, the empty string denoted by single quote or double quote, the number 0, and the special identifier NaN, which just denotes not a number. These are all things that are treated by JavaScript as falsy values. You can easily see an example here. We're defining an undefined object, and then we are saying undefined object. We are using it as a Boolean expression, and then we are saying if undefined object is true, then print this statement, otherwise print this statement which says the value is actually false. Same for the other things that we have we actually defined earlier: the false, the null, the undefined object, the empty string, the number 0, and the symbol not a number. If we run this thing using node.js, it prints 1 false, 2 false, 3 false, 4 false, 5 false, 6 false, which is to say this expression is false, and so it's printing the false value. This expression is false, so it's printing the second statement again. False, false. So what what I'm trying to say here is you should understand that these keywords, identifiers, whatever you want to call them, denote these falsy values. You will see them in literature and code, wherever often people will put them inside if statements, and it is important to remember this. Anything, any object that is not one of these will be treated as a true value by JavaScript. So if you put any object inside if and it is not one of these, then the if statement will treat that value as a true value.